The very question of, wondering if the Syrian revolution is aligned with the aspirations of the left. I mean, this very question was problematized by certain parts of the left as kind of, if you want, a kind of grassroots imperialism, if you want. I mean, these parts of the left problematized the idea that you should only support people who fight for their freedom when they have the same ideology as yours.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Riyad, as always, here with my co-host Mohammed Bouchra, and we're joined once again by Thomas Pierret, who's kindly agreed to continue our last conversation right where we left it off, on Syria and the left. So this is a part 2. And if you haven't listened to our first episode with Thomas, titled Syria and the Future of Islamism, I highly recommend you do so before diving into this one. You can find a link to part 1 in the show notes to this episode or on our website. Just visit muftah.org, that's muftah.org, and navigate to the Protean View tab. Now, we decided to do this episode partly because our last conversation felt like it was left hanging, but also because the debates on Syria that consumed the left in the 2010s were very peculiar and very divisive and really never resolved. Many among the Western left failed and still fail to understand the Syrian revolution in all its messy complexity, and in many cases strongly opposed the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad because any alternative was seen to be worse. Of course, there were leftists who also understood this was a mistaken position to take, and they responded accordingly, many of whom published on Syria in the pages of Muftah magazine, in fact. And here I have in mind Joseph Lahar, Yassin al-Haj Saleh, Louis Pierret, and many others. I'll link to some of those articles in the show notes. But that split within the left wasn't exactly even, and the scale often tipped in the direction of those who opposed the overthrow of the Assad regime. At the same time, that part of the left that supported the revolutionary ambitions of the Syrian people was often lumped, unfairly in my view, with a liberal media and political establishment which also supported the overthrow of Assad for different reasons. This had the effect of making an already very bitter split within the left even more acrimonious. I spent the 2010s arguing with and against those among the left who failed to understand and properly respond to the crisis in Syria, not just because their words and actions represented a moral failing, even though they did, but really because many were justifying support for Assad and making him out to be some lesser evil by drawing on the war on terror playbook, essentially painting him as a secular defender against an Islamic or Islamist horde that might otherwise take over the country. And they supported the brutal campaign he led in the country, largely assisted by Russian and Iranian intervention in the name of security or anti-terrorism or similar claims that I thought the left was supposed to take a critical eye toward. I thought, and I still think, that development represented a unique and dangerous inversion of precisely what leftist politics had to be about if it ever hoped to be relevant or consequential in the future. And it prevented many leftists from at least attempting to organize themselves for Syria in the same way they did for Iraq and more recently for Gaza. I remember sometime in 2017, anti-war coalitions in the West like Answer and Stop the War organized protests following the bombing of some empty government airfield in Syria by the United States, which not only killed no one and caused no significant damage, but was thereafter used by Assad to continue his bombing campaign in the country. The left was totally incensed by that one event, but curiously said very little, if anything at all, about the broader, ongoing campaign by the U.S. coalition in Syria, which was responsible for countless civilian deaths. It was completely bizarre to see the left react in that way, and especially because many oftentimes chanted slogans like "hands off Syria" or "no intervention in Syria," as though the United States and its Western partners had not been actively intervening in and bombing the country for years, since at least 2014. The unfolding post-Assad order is, of course, not ideal. It is complicated, and the current government is not an instantiation of the revolutionary call that first emerged in Syria in 2011. To put it very simply, the new Syrian state can't really be called revolutionary in any meaningful sense of the term. Mohammed and I actually co-wrote an article in Muftah about exactly this issue last June. You can find a link to it in the show notes. But the point remains that the overwhelming majority of Syrians are elated about the end of the Assad dynasty's rule, and they should be. But many among the left can't seem to accept or even comprehend that reality. They can't seem to remember there's no straight or linear path toward liberation pretty much ever. There's no clean or uncomplicated road toward freedom ever. Interestingly enough, Marx makes this point in the 18th Brumaire when he says that revolution is always incomplete and messier than its original call. So it's rather remarkable that much of the left chose to look at Syria and use the messiness of the revolution as a reason to side with the counter-revolution. Of course, no less troubling is the reaction on the other end of those who look to Syria today and naively proclaim the revolution has prevailed. The difference is I expect that kind of a naive response from them, but I was hoping for much better from the left. And perhaps in that expectation, I was naive. So we get into all of this and more with Thomas, of course in a limited way given the constraints of time, but I hope you'll find the conversation useful and at least a starting point for a discussion that we should be continuing together. If you like what we do here at Protean View, please consider joining our community on Patreon at patreon.com/ProteanView, which you can do for as low as $5 a month. You can also subscribe to Muftah Magazine at muftah.org for free to receive our newsletter and updates about the podcast and more. To help us keep this show running, please do follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you find your podcasts. Give us a like, rate us, and share this episode widely with your friends. Thanks for listening and for your support. And here now is our conversation with Thomas Pierret. Thanks for joining us for a part two.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, we're excited for the conversation. So we want to begin with the question of intervention and the left's position on Syria. But before I ask my specific question about that, I think we should define terms here, because one of the, I guess, peculiarities about this debate is that there are a number of people who consider themselves to be part of the left that might not be traditionally left, and there is a debate about who counts as the left. Some of the proponents of interventionism have, in many cases, called themselves leftists, but opponents of it, who also call themselves leftists, have rejected that those individuals are part of the left. So I'm curious to know, what do you consider to be the left? We may disagree here. And do you consider yourself a leftist?
Let's make things simple first. Yeah, I do consider myself to be left, broadly speaking. Now, it's not up to me to decide who counts as the left and who doesn't. What I can try is to define what I see as a leftist position in the broad sense when it comes to the Syrian uprising and the Syrian war. There are actually, as I'm going to explain, two mutually opposite leftist positions on the Syrian conflict. But the two of them are concerned first with emancipation. The problem is that they don't agree on the kind of emancipation they're aspiring to. So on the one hand, you have parts of the left, and let's be completely clear, that's the one I think I belong to, who have prioritized the emancipation or liberation of the Syrian people from the oppression of the Assad regime, which included support for Syrian revolutionaries, including for armed struggle against the Assad regime, and we'll come to it later perhaps. But of course, that might imply also some sort of support for foreign intervention in support of the opposition. Let's call it the pro-revolution left when it comes to Syria. And then the other part of the left was concerned with the emancipation, not so much of the Syrian people, but let's say of Middle Eastern people more broadly, from Western imperialism and Israeli occupation, which led some parts of these, let's say, pro-resistance leftists to support the Assad regime, or at least to show reluctance towards calls for the overthrow of the Assad regime, which was seen by them as a key component of the axis of resistance. So Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and then the Assad regime in the middle, and playing a very important role in keeping it together. So that's what I would call the pro-resistance left. which also include, perhaps at a later stage, especially when Russia joined the fray in 2015, some people who supported the Russian intervention and, by extension, the Assad regime, because they saw that as a challenge to the global U.S. hegemony. And the fact of being either pro-revolution or let's say pro-Syrian revolution or pro-resistance was the root of a very profound divide among the left when it came to Syria. And just to make it clear, what would be a non-left position on Syria, in my view, would be one that does not focus on emancipation, but on preservation. So that's the conservative approach, which are also diverse. So some conservatives would argue that the Assad regime should remain in place to preserve stability, for instance, out of fear for terrorism, jihadi movements. And that's what you would call the paleo-conservative position, or in a US context, that would be the isolationist position. But on the other hand, you have these people who supported the overthrow of the Assad regime to preserve Western and Israeli interests in the region. So that would be the neoconservative position. So you see that both the left and the right were divided over Syria, which made things even more complicated because it paved the way for a kind of objective alignment across the left-right divide, which also explained why the left was so profoundly fractured over Syria. So those on the left who prioritized the overthrow of the Assad regime found themselves objectively on the same side as neoconservatives who were arguing the same for their own reasons. And they were, perhaps more important, they were finding themselves on the same side as, conservative Gulf monarchies, Turkey, the US, you might even say even perhaps Israel at some point. Although that's debatable whether, Israel ever wanted the Assad regime to be toppled. I think overall they didn't want that to happen. But then on the other hand, you have those leftists who prioritized resistance to the US and Israel, who found themselves on the same side as, let's say, right-wing isolationists in the US, for instance. Most notably after the rise of the Islamic State, when I must say, I remember 10 years ago, it was not just the Assad regime, but even Iran itself sometimes became quite popular among certain conservative circles because there was the Assad regime and Iran was seen as bulwark against Sunni jihadis and especially the Islamic State.
I just do want to ask just a point of clarification. So, as you know, in the United States, liberal and leftist have kind of collapsed into each other as near synonyms in popular usage, and that's partly because the American right has applied left as a pejorative. There are obviously other reasons, but I would say, for most people in the world still, and certainly for most political theorists, liberalism and leftism are distinct. And in some ways, they're actually they're partially antagonistic to each other as traditions. Would you agree with that? So when you say leftist, you don't necessarily mean liberal, or do you have a more capacious definition that would include, I don't know, Hillary Clinton supporters who, in various instances, called themselves leftists and supported intervention in Syria?
Well, of course, this divide between leftists and liberals. I mean, it's a very North American typology. We don't have exactly the same here in Europe, I think, but you could still possibly, even Europe could still distinguish between the left and what you call liberal. I mean, if you mean Hillary Clinton would be, I don't know, the center left or social democrats, I suppose, in Europe. Or just the center. That's not really what I was talking about. But the different positions I've outlined on the left, so let's say the pro-revolution stance and the pro-resistance one, is a position you can find among hard leftists, on both sides. Right, but hard leftists, I mean, either from the Marxist tradition, either Trotskyist or so on. You would find hardcore supporters of the Syrian revolution among them, or people perhaps who feel closer to the pro-resistance stance, but also among anarchists, right? You had some anarchist circles who were quite enthusiastic about the Syrian revolution because especially when it came to local councils, which some of them saw as a kind of like council communist experiment. Whether that's what it was or not is another debate. But it was seen also as inspirational by some people who no one would challenge the fact that they are on the left, right? They're even quite far on the left. But yeah, I don't know if I addressed your question.
Yeah, I think that's clear. I think that's clear enough. I just wanted to get a sense of where you stood here and what your position was in terms of, what counts as the left, what doesn't count as the left. I do want to move on to the fracture points. Obviously, intervention was one of them. Were there any other ones? And then also, why was the left in particular so uniquely and strongly divided on Syria of all things? I mean, the left, of course, is not known for being quick to agree on issues, but this issue in particular seems to have strongly divided the left. Why is that?
Absolutely. I mean, problems among the left started to appear. I mean, if you look at the Arab Spring revolutions, everyone was happy to see Mubarak gone. Everyone was happy to see Ben Ali gone. Of course, Libya became a more complicated issue because you had NATO intervention. But what's interesting is that the divide over Syria emerged almost immediately at a moment when there was no Western intervention in Syria. And by the way, there wasn't really any intervention against the Assad regime. I mean, intervention came much later, and it mostly targeted the Islamic State. But the divide emerged like almost overnight. And I think the key issue was really, at first at least, it was really about this axis of resistance thing, where some leftists consider that the collapse of the Assad regime would lead to the weakening of the axis of resistance and the weakening of the Palestinian movements. Syria being the sort of back office of Hamas and Palestinian Jihad and Hezbollah as well. I think that was the core issue, but other issues emerged quite early on. One was about sects and sectarianism, because immediately the uprising and the conflict in Syria raised issues about sectarian identity, about Sunnis taking over in Syria. I think that was the core issue, which some people on the left problematized, either because of their own personal background, because they might come from that region and come from, other religious communities, and so they might have been afraid of what would happen if, a Sunni majority regime was to emerge in Syria, possibly dominated by Islamists, which is also a concern that emerged very early among some parts of the left. And sectarianism also was not just a matter of opinion. That was also a problem of analysis. So you had like a divide, which, by the way, cut across both parts of the left. I mean, both the pro-resistance crowd and the pro-revolution one, with people who were comfortable with the sectarian reading of the situation. So let's say on the pro-resistance side, you would find people who tell you, well, it's true that the Syrian regime is dominated by Alawites, but that's good because they will preserve secularism and protect minorities. On the other hand, you have people maybe who feel not comfortable with that kind of reading and who would emphasize the cross-sectarian nature of the Syrian regime, or at least the cross-sectarian support for the Assad regime. But that's a divide you find also among the pro-revolution leftists, with some of them who emphasize the sectarian character of the regime and identify it as the main source or at least one of the main sources of the regime's violence. I mean, that's, again, to be honest, that's my position. I've written about it. And other people feel uncomfortable with that kind of, let's say, sectarian lens, be it for ideological reasons, because they have a Marxist background that doesn't sit easily with sectarian analysis, or a personal background, especially, the reluctance to read the situation in sectarian terms is something that was widespread among Syrian opponents in the sense of pro-revolution Syrians from religious minorities, and some of them really emphasized the cross-sectarian character of both the regime and opposition, and really wanted to emphasize the fundamentally political nature of the conflict. And yet another issue that divided the left was the rise of the Rojava project in northeastern Syria, which appeared as a third way approach that was endorsed by parts of the left, despite the fact that, just like the Syrian opposition, the people who were setting up this Rojava, this autonomous administration in northern Syria, were also supported by the US, and perhaps in a far more effective and direct way than the Syrian opposition. But nevertheless, support for the Rojava was legitimized in the eyes of its supporters among Western leftists by different issues, by the fact that it was fighting against ISIS, but by the fact that they were fighting for Kurdish rights, which had been suppressed in many countries around the region for decades. And finally, because Rojava was presented as an alternative model of governance, or more exactly self-governance, inspired by leftist ideology named democratic confederalism, which is presented itself as libertarian, feminist, and which it has been actually one of the few leftist utopias left in our time. So that's why it was so attractive to certain segments of the left.
Can I just ask, when did U.S. intervention in Syria begin? I heard you say it came much later. Do you mean later than September 2014, when the U.S. began striking Syria, or is that what you meant?
Of course, if we speak of direct intervention, yes, that's September 2014. And if you speak of covert intervention in the sense of arms supplies to the rebels, that would be mostly, well, they got involved as of late 2012. But initially, very much, their main concern was to monitor how things were going. So, arms supplies were going on because Gulf countries, were sending weapons and money anyway. So arms were flowing in. So the CIA got involved essentially because it wanted to know who was receiving what. That was their main concern. Especially because they find that some of the groups, Qatar was arming, for instance, were not really palatable. They were too Islamist in their view. So that's why they got involved.
I know that we often talk about the question of intervention as in binary terms, as between those who rejected intervention and those who supported intervention, but it was, of course, a lot more complicated than that, as some of your comments have already suggested. There were those among the left, particularly here in America, that supported the right of the Syrian people to call for help in any and all forms, while themselves being skeptical of calls for liberation at the hands of the U.S. government, in part because the U.S., as was just said, was already an intervening force as early as 2014. And if we take what you just said, really in some sense as early as 2012, it had already been in Syria. So maybe you can just talk us through some of the finer divisions in that respect.
Well, of course, it's very, very obvious that the pro-resistance part of the left was entirely opposed to Western intervention, not necessarily to Iranian or Russian intervention for their own reasons. On the other side, there were divisions for the reasons you explained. But, a counter argument to that was that, okay, the US was involved, but the US was also preventing certain weapons to be delivered to the Syrian rebels. Let's take a very a clear illustration of that. In 2013, apparently it's Qatar who purchased surface-to-air missiles and shipped them to Syrian rebels. And so in mid-2013, you see Syrian rebels, starting to shoot down a few planes and helicopters. And that's something the Syrian rebels and also, civilian activists were asking for, because they said, many of us are dying because of air strikes against civilian targets. and we need something to protect ourselves from the regime's power. Uh, these deliveries of surface-to-air missiles suddenly stopped at some point in 2013, apparently because the US pressured Qatar and asked them to stop doing it because they were too afraid that these missiles might fall in the wrong hands, be used against civilian airplanes and so on. So the US intervention was not necessarily making, or at least, it was perhaps helping the rebels to challenge the regime to a certain extent, but that was not enough to allow them to win. That was the reproach that was formulated by some rebels and some of their supporters in the West, including even some people among the left. Sorry. Now, when it comes to direct intervention, it also found supporters among the left for, I think, three reasons. One which you mentioned is that many Syrian opponents were asking for it first. Second, it could save many lives quite immediately because many, especially by 2013, so many people were killed by random airstrikes on civilian areas that just grounding these helicopters or aircraft would have saved lives. Very, very, almost overnight. The third argument also was that the opposition was sometimes quite close to the tipping point where it might have been able, with some limited external support, to win the war. That was the case by late 2012, by mid 2015, just before the Russian intervention, which means that no one was ever asking for the US occupation of Syria or anything that remotely resembled the invasion of Iraq in 2003, because there was a sizable, armed component to the Syrian opposition. Of course, now there's the debate of how that the fact that no one can deny that significant chunks of that armed opposition was very problematic for different reasons. But at least the kind of foreign intervention that was asked for did not at all resemble any kind of occupation or boots on the grounds or whatever.
Really what they were asking for, as I understand it, was the removal of Assad. But how did they expect that was going to happen when the U.S. was, as we said, already an intervening force and did not seem interested in taking out the Assad regime? What was the expectation there? That people were going to pressure the U.S. government to change where it was bombing, like stop bombing ISIS targets and then just turn your direction to Assad and take him out? Because that to me seems like, it always seemed to me back then, even though I was a supporter of the people's right to call on help in whatever form they wanted, but it seemed to me that was a naive expectation that the U.S. was going to save Syrians in that way.
I think most people were realistic enough to realize that the US wasn't interested, but that's what they were trying to lobby. And lobby maybe is a bit strong, but that was the whole point. It was to advocate for that kind of shift, which again was, the idea was that I don't know if it's true. You will never know, but that you didn't need a massive military involvement of the US to tip the balance. That the idea was that simply paralyzing regime forces, or some parts of the regime's military apparatus, especially the Air Force, would make the regime weak enough to allow the rebels to overturn the situation and topple the regime. That was the idea. I don't think no one was seriously expecting the regime to carry out like a massive, campaign of airstrikes, let alone, of course, send boots on the ground. I don't think it's because you ask for something which is unlikely that you're naive. It's precisely because you know that it's not, that there are serious reluctance to that you're asking for it and trying to advocate for it.
As I said, I was a strong supporter of the right of the Syrian people to call on any and all forms of assistance against the kind of brutal oppression that they were facing from multiple sides. But I'm speaking from my standpoint as an American, understanding how the U.S. government and the U.S. Power elites function. They I just didn't see them as a liberating force. And so, just speaking from that perspective, and also from the perspective of someone who's on the left, it seemed that to me, when I would hear, well, we just have to pressure the US government to just liberate the Syrian people, it seemed to me to misunderstand fundamentally why the US was in Syria to begin with. It wasn't in the interest of the Syrian people, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, but the idea is that first, the idea was for Syrians to liberate themselves and to leverage US intervention. When the US started bombing the Islamic State and Al Qaeda in northern Syria in 2014, it would not have been completely inconceivable that they also decide that wherever they were flying, the Syrian Air Force would not be allowed to fly, which is not what happened. So basically, over northern Syria, Syrian aircraft would continue to fly over Aleppo and drop barrel bombs over Aleppo. And it would have been very easy for the US to prevent that from happening. I think even like a mere threat would have been enough. They wouldn't even have to kill anyone to secure that result. So, again, that it was not expectation that the US would liberate anyone, but that its intervention could be leveraged to, of course, to secure their own interests. So, as a scholar, sometimes I've been invited by people from foreign ministries, and especially at that time, whatever your own political opinions, when you're trying to convince those people, you address them by using arguments that make sense to them. And of course, it's perfectly clear that if you're just talking about the Syrian people's longing for freedom, they won't care much. You have to talk about security, about regional stability, and so on. And then one of my argument was that like allowing a conflict to fester like this for years, and allowing people to be slaughtered in on such a scale would only create waves of refugees, radicalization, so things that would eventually harm US interests. So I know that, you have to speak their language, right?
Sorry, Mohammed, I've been talking for a while. I know you have questions. Please jump in.
So something else I wanted to ask was, beyond the question of dividing the left, Syria, more than any other conflict, seems to have also represented a major breaking point for politics and for people's political trajectories in general. Many people appear to have become completely jaded or even broken as a result of their experiences as activists or even just active observers of the Syrian conflict. So, as examples, some people who were previously staunch leftists have become much more ambiguous or even perhaps pro-capitalist in their orientation. People who were previously very pro-Palestine and staunchly anti-Zionist have become much more ambiguous in terms of that relation, and they seem to kind of view, oh, well, what difference is a Syrian life to a Palestinian life, the way they will typically come and frame it. They're just much more, they've really been shaken by this conflict. And people who are, again, very critical of American imperialism in the region have become, again, much more maybe pro-American, or just, not anti-American as they used to be. So why is it that Syria specifically seems to have kind of engendered this kind of difference? And why is it something that we see again and again, perhaps even like throughout the Middle East and even among many activists elsewhere in the West?
First, I think part of the shift you mentioned is I think very much a reaction to, let's say, the position of the pro-resistance left. Okay, some people were just disgusted that to see how can you be a leftist and support a murderous regime like the Assad regime, support Hezbollah's intervention in Syria. So I think that's the reason why some people reacted and as you say, perhaps became more ambiguous in their, for instance, their support for the Palestinians. With regard to attitudes towards the US, I think you also need to contextualize such attitudes, and I don't think it was a durable shift. We have to remember who the US was at the time. We're mostly when we speak about intervention, we're mostly speaking about, the period ranging from 2011 to 2016, 17. So we're talking about Obama's, first and second term. I mean, the end of his first term and his second one. So you have a president who has presented himself as against U.S. intervention in the Middle East, who's promised he would withdraw U.S. troops from Iraq, which he did by 2011, and who's, clearly unwilling to get involved in the Middle East and then gets, brought back to the Middle East, especially because of ISIS, but very reluctantly. So I assume perhaps, it was a lot easier for people on the left to support some sort of U.S. intervention, having someone like Obama in power. Knowing that, it was not kind of hardline U.S. imperialism that might have existed before, and especially after. I don't think people who supported U.S. intervention at the time have any sympathy for the current stance of the U.S. government in the Middle East, be it with regard to Israel or with Iran or whatever. I think the context is very important here.
I think that's the thing that's a bit curious to me, is because when we talk about these transformations, at least in my own experience, it often is tracking on with what's going on today. Not to say that these people have suddenly now, are active supporters, let's say, of the genocide in Gaza, but precisely at this moment when the genocide is taking place, they look at that and they are much more ambiguous about what's going on. They are much more reluctant about supporting the Palestinian resistance. They are much more reluctant to call out the American involvement as something that is outright evil or to be called out. Or so it's precisely during this current conflict now in Palestine where we're seeing these kind of broken, jaded positions come out, and their justification always goes back to the Syrian conflict. Well, we saw what happened there, so I don't know, I'm much more ambiguous. So this is one part of it. The other part of it is, I'm curious, the transformations that we're talking about, from my experience, seem to all be in one direction, from leftist to more maybe pro-capitalist, from anti-imperialist to, not being as critical of U.S. imperialism, from staunchly anti-Zionist to, well, I don't know, whoever's doing the killing, what does it matter if the Iranian or the Hezbollah or the Israel? They're all, what's a Syrian life and a Palestinian life? So it all seems to be going in one direction. Is that the case, or are there other trajectories that we're not seeing?
Look, perhaps, there is a difference of perception here, because I really don't see what you describe in the context I'm familiar with here in France or in Europe, or maybe I missed something. But my impression was rather that the genocide in Gaza had sort of reconciled the left to an extent, while leaving aside perhaps the most hardcore, tanky type of left. But yeah, and also it had, Gaza had this result of pulling apart perhaps the parts of the left that had moved closer to, let's say, neoconservative circles, and bring them back to the left. And yeah, I don't have very clear examples, and maybe I don't know, maybe I understand, maybe you don't want to name people here, but I don't have very clear example in mind of people who, we're talking about the left here, right? Who are left and who are ambiguous with regard to the situation in Gaza. In France, I would say if you find people on the left who don't speak much about Gaza, it's not so much because they don't care or because of Syria. It's often because they've been spooked by all the repression, the intimidation and so forth.
I don't know if you wanted to follow up with any more specific stuff about this, because I know you experienced something similar.
Similar in what regard? Remind me.
just about this thing about people's political trajectories having gone completely like off, the people who are, moving away from the left and towards more soft positions towards
Yeah. Oh, based on what we were talking about yesterday
Yeah,
with
exactly, yeah.
It's hard to
Anything,
frame
I
it
don't
as I want to ask the question, but it's really hard to frame it as a question because it feels like it's something that's still developing.
Yeah.
It's hard to put a pin on it, and it's hard to put names on it. But
Yeah,
in
no,
it's
exactly.
really hard to put names on it. I mean, in my experience, I know a few people who used to be staunchly pro-Palestine,
Mhm.
and somehow the past decade, beginning with Syria and then culminating in the genocide in Gaza has just completely broken them. I mean, they're not part of the left anymore, even if they'll say it if you ask them, but in every other respect, they're clearly something else. And they've both given up hope on everything, but that's entrenched them in the existing system. Like they just seem to the experience of being broken has just moved them in the direction of just liberal centrism, just cookie cutter liberal centrism, which by the way, in my view is just a reflection of what happens when you do lose that hope, because you end up just gravitating to where the centers of power are. In the, I think, vain hope that you might actually affect change that way.
It's almost like an exhaustion and a lack of political imagination, as well as hope, like you mentioned.
Certainly, definitely, yeah. But in terms of asking it as a question, it's hard to do that because there's not a lot of literature to point to. There's not a lot of really much of anything to point to except at this time personal experience. I think in the next decade we're going to have a lot to talk about. But right now I think people are just individually coming to realize in their own ways, mostly through interpersonal connection and communication and, seeing things here and there, maybe on Twitter, that like there is something brewing here. There's something brewing here and it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I can think of one guy who I'm not going to name, who writes in English, wrote a book about the Syrian Revolution, was a staunch supporter of the Syrian Revolution, coming from the left, but grew at some point disgusted with the left in general. Yet, maybe you know who I mean, but that guy, the guy I'm thinking about is absolutely unambiguous with regard to Palestine and Gaza.
He moved in a different direction?
No, my point is that he moved he got estranged from the left at the height of the Syrian war. Because of all the issues we discussed with the pro-resistance crowd and so on.
Oh, I see.
But my point is that what has been going on in Gaza for 3 years has brought him back to a more, let's say, traditional anti-imperialist position. That's my point. It was not a durable shift. That's what I mean.
It almost made me wonder, Riyadh, whether, because I think both of us, in terms of our experiences, it's certainly people in North America and people in or from the Middle East. Maybe Europe, I'm wondering if it's somewhat insulated from this because of more visibility to leftist parties. I don't know really, honestly, what the explanation might be, but like you said, it's something that's still brewing, so who knows?
Right.
So for all this talk that we have about Syria and the left, the question remains, were there or are there any genuine leftist groups or voices within Syria itself during the revolution? In which case, who or where are they? Beyond that, again, are we talking about groups which are viable? Are they sizable? And are these the only, because sometimes I think leftists might, elsewhere in the international left might have a tendency to be a bit tribal about this almost. So they'll only focus on those parties as being legitimate. And so is that what happened? Or, who are we talking about when we talk about the left in the Syrian context?
I mean, first, if you speak of the armed rebellion, the left was insignificant in it. I mean, there were like a few very small leftist battalions, but they quickly disappeared and they were really insignificant. Now, if you look at the rest of the opposition, the place of the left is not completely insignificant. I mean, first, if you look at, let's say, Syrian dissidents at large, Syrian, dissident intellectuals, well, the most famous among them, I mean, the only one who, as far as I know, has been translated, I mean, whose book have been translated into English even before the revolution, Yassin al-Saleh, is someone who I mean, he spent many years of his life in jail because he was a member in a leftist party, and still considers himself as part of the left. If I think the more institutional kind of opposition, Burhan Ghaliun, who was the first chairman of the Syrian National Council, who is also a veteran dissident intellectual, I think also broadly speaking comes from the left. Now, you also find many people from leftist parties in what used to be called the tolerated opposition. So these were opponents who were based, most of them were based inside, Syria, even in Damascus, okay, right, in regime control areas. And they were tolerated. I would say tolerated. They were not completely accepted or legal, because some members of these circles might sometimes be arrested and even disappear. But no, I'm thinking of an organization like the National Coordination Body, which was very much disliked by the rest of the opposition because they were seen as too soft with the regime, and also too soft with the regime's foreign backers. They were advocating negotiation with Iran and Russia. But for the very same reason, they were often very much appreciated by the pro-resistance left. So that's one thing. Now, if you look at the bulk of the Syrian civilian opposition, it's not left-wing, definitely. I mean, it's broadly speaking conservative. But at the same time, it had a very loosely defined ideology. If you want it, perhaps it was sort of amorphous, ideologically speaking, which means that for foreign leftist supporters of the revolution, I mean, there was still some possibility to sympathize with them, on the basis that they did not have like a clearly articulated, let's say, right-wing ideology or Islamist ideology. Here, I'm not talking about, of course, movements like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and so forth, but I'm talking about, let's say, this whole, these networks of activists and so on, who did not articulate a very clear ideology, which means that some people in the left might also project their own aspirations upon their movement. Let's, take the example of the local councils. So in regions of Syria that escaped the control of the regime, you have early on, people setting up local councils for very practical reasons. That was about, collecting trash, organizing food deliveries, negotiating with rebel factions, these sort of things. These local councils also, they were often dominated by notable figures, fairly wealthy people or important people in the neighborhood, clerics and so on. Yet some revolutionary activists in Syria saw these local councils as something else, or as a stepping board for something else, as the basis of a different kind of political order. There is one anarchist intellectual named Omar Aziz who wrote about them and early on and theorized these local councils as something that could be the basis for a different participatory kind of political system. Omar Aziz was murdered by the Assad regime while in detention. Of course, it seems not that many people have heard about him. I mean, at least many people who run these local councils across Syria did not know about Omar Aziz and his ideas, and probably didn't share them. Some did, and it's been debated among foreign supporters of the revolution. But maybe I'd like to come to another issue, which is that the very question of, wondering if the Syrian revolution is aligned with the aspirations of the left. I mean, this very question was problematized by certain parts of the left as a kind of, if you want, a kind of grassroots imperialism, if you want. I mean, these parts of the left problematized the idea that you should only support people who fight for their freedom when they have the same ideology as yours. That you can't just support them because they no longer want to live under a regime that has oppressed them for decades and disappeared thousands of people, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, and destroyed cities and so on. So that very question was problematized by certain segments of the left. That support for Syrian revolutionaries should not be made conditional on the endorsement of certain ideas, but basically the endorsement of our own political preferences by Syrian revolutionaries.
Okay, Thomas, you mentioned that most Syrians are not ideologically leftist. You said broadly they're conservative. I think most people that consider themselves part of the international left would agree. So then maybe you could just tell us, what were the aims of the Syrian people when they initially rose up against the regime? What were their short-term aims and long-term aims? And then what were the main desires of the international left when it came to Syria? What did they want to see? And then to what extent were there points of convergence and points of divergence when it came to what the Syrian people wanted to see and what the international left wanted to see? And when I say international left here, I mean both those who were, broadly supportive of the revolution and those who were broadly critical of the revolution.
If you look at demonstrations in 2011 or, political platforms issued by various parts of the Syrian opposition, they were deliberately vague. I mean, the goals were very broad. They were very general. It was about, toppling the regime. It was about freedom, dignity, establishing a civilian state, which was itself an ambiguous notion. And of course, as you know, the main divide was not right versus left. It was secularist versus Islamists. And so civilian state, for instance, was understood by secularists as a secular state and by Islamists as a state that was not run by either the military or by clerics, but by civilians. So, and of course, I mean, the fact that, the slogans, the aims were defined in a very loose way was designed to ensure consensus. To make sure that everyone would remain on board. And it makes sense. I mean, you don't get into very divisive issues when you still haven't toppled the regime and when you're in fact not close at all from succeeding at that, right? I mean, you won't stop talking about, will we ban alcohol or not on day one of the demonstrations. I'm referring to that because it's a hot issue now in Syria. So, yeah, the aims, it would be hard to define what were the long-term aims of the Syrian opposition at the time. And in a way, the idea was also that the revolution had to be carried out to allow for Syrians to disagree and to have a proper political life, which involves disagreement over key issues, but that you were in a situation for decades in Syria where that was not possible at all. You just had to follow the regime. So the whole point was to change that situation and establish a system where you could have, political conflicts, ideally in a non-violent form. But I would say there was a fairly broad agreement over, let's say, a liberal system in the political sense. I think there was a very broadly shared aspiration to, free elections, a parliament, these sorts of things, accountability. I think, people who aspired to a more radical forms of democracy were probably a very small minority among them, which, of course, was not really super attractive to the international left, I think. I mean, at least to those parts of the international left that really wanted to see a leftist agenda, a proper leftist agenda being implemented in Syria. But to be honest, I think that domestic politics was never the priority for anyone. I mean, for even those hard leftists who problematized the fact that the Syrian opposition was too conservative or was not really left, which is the kind of opinion you'd find frequently among the pro-resistance part of the left. But these people, I think, approached revolutions in the region from day one through the lens of of U.S. hegemony, right? I think what the reason they valued the Egyptian revolution was not so much because they were sincerely hoping that a leftist regime would emerge in Egypt. It was because they were happy to see one of the pillars of the U.S. hegemony in the region collapse. Or at least that's the impression we had at the time. One of the best friends of the U.S. being toppled, and I think that's what they were interested in.
So then, is this why there were a number of leftists internationally who were opposed to seeing the Assad regime fall, because they basically thought that the Assad regime was a pillar of resistance? And if you take
absolutely
right,
yeah.
I wanted to ask about the relationship that the left seems to have, that's sometimes awkward, it's sometimes maybe uncomfortable, with Islamists. One example of this is obviously the alignment with the axis of resistance. So, Iran, Ansar Allah in Yemen, Hezbollah, and obviously Hamas. And you often witness a few different kind of versions of this, where on the one hand, you have the celebration of these groups by often Western leftists, but they take several approaches. On the one hand, they might completely paper over or downplay or just ignore and gloss over the Islamist dimension to these groups, or just the Islam dimension of these groups, right? They will just not mention it. You have others who go a different route, where they will only focus on the kind of few remaining leftist groups that are part of these alliances. So you have some Western leftists, they talk about Gaza, and then they'll talk about PFLP, and to the exception of any other groups. Also, even downplaying the kind of Islamic sloganeering put forth by groups like the PFLP and used in their propaganda. You have a few who might be much more comfortable with the kind of these Islamic dimensions of these groups. But what are we to make of this? First of all, why this awkwardness, and then why then even the celebration of these groups? And why is it literally just because they see that these are the only groups that are doing anything about imperialism, so they kind of are in a position where they have to celebrate them, but they really don't want to because they're not sufficiently leftist or they're too Islamist?
Yeah, I suppose it's about necessity. And I would say in principle, I can relate to that kind of position. I mean, if you have a situation where, people suffer from oppression, either at the hands of of their own government or foreign occupation, I think it makes sense to support, the leading political forces that that fight against that kind of oppression, even if they're not, they don't have the same political preferences as yours. I mean, I suppose, of course, that these are political. I mean, that these are movements with broad popular support, right? The problem, I think, there was something very hypocritical, very much some double standards when it came to Syria. And sorry if I return to Syria, but which is that the same people who would celebrate, let's say, Hezbollah, for instance, would immediately problematize the fact that some religious slogans were heard in demonstrations in Syria. I'm not even talking about, jihadi groups or whatever, but like in the very first weeks. So you hear people demonstrating in Homs and, praising Prophet Muhammad in their slogans. And then you have some hard leftists who were like super hardline supporters of Hezbollah who immediately come out and say, well, look, these are Salafis, they're crazy, they should certainly not be allowed to rule over Syria. I mean, there were like definitely double standards here that were entirely related to where these different groups sat in the regional chessboard. Which I think is very hypocritical. But I've no doubt that I suppose if there were sizable leftist groups in the region, then they would support them. Which is, by the way, why a non-negligible number of leftists in across the world have become so enthusiastic about the Kurdish project in northern Syria.
So then, just to come back to the earlier point or question about whether Assad was really a pillar of resistance to imperialism, to Western hegemony, to Zionism, yes, there were obviously a number of leftists that held to that position. Is there any material truth to it? Is there any reality to that point, or is it, in your view, just pure delusion? I mean, one thing that always comes to mind for me when I think about this question are the CIA black sites in Syria that Assad was obviously not just a party to, but a major facilitator of.
Yeah, well, there have been two responses among pro-revolution leftists to the argument that Assad was a pillar of the axis of resistance. And the first argument is the one you just outlined, which is to cast doubts over the resistance credentials of that regime by highlighting this its ambivalent attitude toward the US, as you say, running black sites. And by the way, it's as old as the Assad regime itself. I mean, by Assad, I mean Hafez, not Bashar. Like early on, Hafez al-Assad was accused by the Syrian opposition of having sold out the Golan Heights to Israel. Which I'm not saying is true, but that early on his resistance credentials were very much questioned by the opposition. And then you have other episodes like the Syrian intervention against the PLO in Lebanon in 1976. Then the Syrian partnership with the US during the Kuwait War in 1991. In exchange for the authorization to establish Syrian hegemony over Lebanon. But my own analysis as a political scientist and historian is that, Syria has had a fairly ambiguous policy that at times it has cooperated with the US, at times it has opposed the US, and since you mentioned the black sites for the CIA, at times it has done both at the same time. So if you look at the mid 2000s, at the same time they were working with the CIA, in this, helping them chasing suspected jihadi militants in the region, but they were also supporting insurgents in Iraq. They were really doing different things at the same time. I would say that on balance, overall, the Syrian regime, the late Syrian regime throughout its history probably did more to undermine, perhaps it's too strong, but let's say undermine US interests in the region than foster them or support them. Yet, there is another response, which is my own take on the issue, which is that, whatever the Syrian regime did or did not to oppose US hegemony in the region, that does not justify the existence of a regime that has murdered such a large number of inhabitants of its own country, turned entire cities into rubble. I don't think anything justifies that. I think even if their anti-imperialist record was perfectly clean, that would not be a justification for preserving the existence of a regime that has engaged in extermination and mass killing on such a scale.
You had mentioned the kind of Western leftist enthusiasm for the Kurdish project. And this brings me to another question, which was there was a certain point where certain segments of the Western left had a sort of fetishistic almost relationship with this project, where they would go on, sign up and join and go to the front line to, well, I guess go shoot Muslims, right? Because they had that kind of ideology. And to ask a kind of parallel question with this, we can see, people who otherwise are maybe very critical of the kind of US imperialist project would very quickly, on the left, would quickly pivot to using war on terror language when describing certain segments of kind of the Islamic or Islamist opposition. So they, talk about extremism and talk about terrorism and sometimes just trade in typical kind of Islamophobic language. How are we to read this? Again, this dual thing where on the one hand they are perhaps, anti-Islamophobic in when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, but then very quickly and be prepared to trade in those tropes and even maybe go to enact some kind of fantasy in that regard.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that whoever went to fight with the Kurdish forces was willing to shoot Muslims. I mean, there were few guys like these, but I think most of them were probably quite sincere. They were sincere believers in these, so-called democratic confederalist ideals, and the idea that this autonomous administration in northern Syria, it's not just for the Kurds, it's for everyone, equal rights for all ethnicities and religions and so forth, which I think was quite right. I mean, was the case. My own problem with that polity or that political entity was that it was basically a single party regime. In my view, there was great tolerance for religious and ethnic pluralism, but very little tolerance for political pluralism. But I might say, I think most of the people who supported that project were latecomers to the Syrian issue. I mean, if you can say that, perhaps 2 or 3 years, but I think that's not people who were very much interested in the Syrian issue early on. They were neither with the opposition nor with the regime. I mean, these are people who basically discovered Syria because there was this, leftist experiment going on. As I said earlier, one of perhaps the only leftist utopia alive in our times, which made it so attractive to many leftists across the world. But my problem with much of the literature written by supporters of this experiment, which is that it's extremely uncritical. They basically take it for granted. Whatever they're told, they take it for granted, and they have very little interest in the way this entity was actually operating, which in my view was in a fairly authoritarian fashion.
So you would downplay this kind of almost Islamophobic dimension because it was certainly played up by many people who went over.
Yeah,
there was this kind of almost as a fetishistic dimension with, these are the women shooting at the extremists and so on, and I'm joining to kind of kill the extremists, and it certainly was a visible dimension.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some people were into that, and there was even a funny story of some kind of skinhead who went there really hoping he would shoot Muslims, and then being horrified when he discovered that he was among a bunch of hard leftists or communists. I mean, but I think that's still a minority of these foreign volunteers who went there. I think maybe they were, perhaps initially attracted by these images of female fighters and so on, but I gather that there were strong believers in this. I mean, I think that they were very much attracted by the political model that was offered. I mean, which they really perceived as a genuine alternative to the nation state and so on. I would not dismiss their sincerity. I think they were perhaps naive very often, but I think most of them were quite sincere. And then the perhaps the Islamophobic kind of rhetoric might not always have been a motivation or a cause of their departure or their willingness to join the fight there, but that's an argument they used to delegitimize the enemies of the of the autonomous administration. So, for instance, if in those circles, when you were identified as a supporter of the Syrian opposition, meaning the opposition to the Assad regime, they would immediately attribute your stance to the fact that you were either an Islamist or an Arab nationalist. Okay, I'm neither an Islamist nor an Arab nationalist, yes, but I have been accused of being both because I was a supporter of the Syrian opposition.
One question we wanted to return to was the supply lines question. So we had touched upon this briefly in our last interview. Since then, there's been a clip circulating, an interview with Amir Mousawi, the former Iranian diplomat, in which he states that the supply line situation in Syria today is actually a lot better than it was under Assad, which is, again, one of the main justifications that anti-imperialist leftists would have for maintaining the Assad regime. So he's basically saying that no, it's specifically the kind of HTS guys today who are facilitating the supply lines between Iran and Hezbollah. And he puts it down to a complete lack of ideology. Just these people are in it for the money. And for that reason, the supply line situation is a lot better today. That was, again, it's a recent interview that has been circulating in Arabic. I don't know if you managed to see it.
Well, that's interesting. I missed that, to be honest. It's absolutely not surprising that you can buy much in a country that's in such a desperate economic situation. So bribing local commanders to get some weapons shipment across the border is probably not that difficult if you can pay. Objectively speaking, I think it's. I mean, they will never admit it. Okay, and they're telling the exact opposite. But I think it's in the interest of the current Syrian government that the Israelis do not succeed too much in their operation against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, because I mean the farther they go in southern Lebanon, the closer they get to Damascus. I think there would be much anxiety in Damascus if the Israeli army was, stationed. I mean, they already are very close to the city of Damascus, but invading southern Lebanon would basically make them even more present in the area, which is not a good situation for the Syrian government. So they're having an interest in. I mean, despite their very difficult history with Hezbollah. Objectively speaking, they have a shared interest in preventing the Israelis from advancing too much northward in Lebanon. But that said, I'm not saying they're actively supporting Hezbollah, because that would be a very risky business. Because the moment the Israelis discover it, they will make them pay. Also, the U.S. might reconsider, lifting sanctions and so on. So that I don't think that they want to take that risk. Now, I'm still, but I'm not there. But I'm still surprised. I mean, to hear that when he says that the supply lines are in a better shape now because what's going on is still going on in a fairly underground fashion, whereas before they were just driving trucks across the border. So I don't know.
Because essentially the way he framed it was actually a bit beyond just like people taking bribes. The way he framed it was like, we are working with Jolani's people, and they're offering it the kind of the services at lower prices than what we had to previously pay. So effectively, it seems that for better for worse, they are supporting the Hezb. And again, we have to kind of interpret it in one way or another. Either is this literally, like you're saying, a question of desperation, lack of ideology, lack of principles, just people wanting money, or is it, as you're also saying, like this question of people looking at it and saying, in the grand scheme of things, maybe this is in our interest, even though we are not particularly fond of Hezbollah.
I really don't know. I mean, that would be funny, that I gather that the military commanders in the late Assad regime had been used to take bribes for so many years, and they were probably very demanding. whereas the new guys, they're fairly disciplined, military force, and I don't think they're used to so much bribe. So maybe they just ask less. That would be very, very funny. I don't know.
Okay, Thomas, we have just one last question here. Was the left, in your view, or at least certain segments of the left, was the left right to be cynical about the revolution given the direction of the current government? And do you think the left was, in at least some respects, right about the so-called impending failure of the revolution? I know it's a loaded question, but take it in whatever direction you think is best.
I assume that the response to that argument would be twofold. I mean, first, one would be to argue that had the revolution succeeded earlier, the outcome might have been different. And of course, we'll never know. That's pure speculation, but you could still argue that. I mean, it might have been better, it might have been worse. I mean, we'll never know. The other, you'll find many people in Syria today who are like, pro-revolution activists who have absolutely no sympathy for the new government, for its project, its ideology. They're very critical of the way they're confiscating power. And yet they have absolutely no regret. Because, I mean, there still is a sea change between, before and after the fall, where, millions of people are allowed to return home. Thousands are freed from their jail. And I know there are perhaps new people getting jail now, but not on the same scale as was the case before. I mean, state violence doesn't compare to what it used to be. With two major exceptions, of course, which I don't want to dismiss, which are the massacres that targeted Alawites in March last year and Druzes in July, and of course. It's perfectly understandable that Syrians who have been, whose communities have been the targets of these massacres see things very differently. Provided, let's say, even if Syria remains, what it seems it's going to be like, fairly autocratic, conservative / Islamist regime, provided there are no other large scale, waves of sectarian violence or communal violence, or I think that would still be an improvement compared to what Syria was under the Assad.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Thomas, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Send us an email at proteanview@muftah.org. If you're hearing this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of our show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org and navigate to the Protean View tab to see all our episodes. And follow us on our socials using the handle @Protean View, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.